Hi, I'm the Brewmaster. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. As you can see, I've been going through some cards. Over the last few weeks, I've built 3 new commander decks, updated 3 more, and I'm thinking about a few different things that I can put together with what's left. But it got me thinking, where does the power level in commander decks come from? And the conclusion I came to probably isn't what you'd think. If you want to hear more, pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So before we start talking about the power level of decks, I think it's important that we're able to recognize the power levels of individual cards. And so I want to break power levels into 3 separate categories. Different cards provide different types of power. And the first that I want to cover is something that I consider the most important type of power that a card can provide. And that is structural power. There's a lot of cards that allow you to change the rules of the game in your favor. A good example of this is any card that breaks one of the single rules of Magic, right? If you think about the things during your turn that you can only do once. You untap once, you draw a card once, you play a land once, and you can attack once. You'll note that most combos are going to loop one of these and allow you to do it many, many times. Between those 4 categories, if we're just looking at raw numbers, we can say if we do any one of these 4 times, we've taken an extra turn. That's why Rhystic Study, if you're able to play that early and nobody's paying the 1, you're drawing 3 extra cards per turn, you are almost getting a full turn worth of value every time it goes around the table. So you're 1 turn ahead, 2 turns ahead, 3 turns ahead, and it just continues. Now, if everybody pays the 1, that sets them back. Everything costs 1 mana more. If they're only playing 1 card per turn, they're a full turn behind, which means Rhystic Study either sets the table back by 1 turn or moves you ahead by 1 turn every turn. That's why people generally recognize that you should always pay the 1 on Rhystic Study instead of feeding a ton of cards to that person, because they're getting very far ahead without having a lot of table presence, and so it's a little bit stealth. Another good example of a structural advantage card, a structural power card that snuck by, is Skull Clamp. I think many people have said this card should probably never have been printed. It was banned very quickly, and it remains an extremely powerful card because it lets you draw cards and kill your small creatures, and it stays on the battlefield to do it all over again. If you're able to Skull Clamp twice in a turn, you've kind of taken an extra turn, just with the amount of value that you've gotten. Those cards are critical to the power level of a deck. And I think that's the first place you look when determining a deck's power level. The second place you look is in mechanical power. The actual text on the cards, in a vacuum, evaluating how good a card is. An example that I pulled out just now is Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. It's got a whole bunch of text, it's got a huge stat line, and this card is colorless, so it goes in anything, as long as you can get up to the amount of mana to cast it. It's a good card to include. Not saying that every deck should have it, but mechanically it's a very powerful card, and if you look at the dollar value, it's also up there. I think one of the mistakes that people make is looking at the dollar value. They try to find how many cards in the deck are on the reserve list, how many cards belong in a rare binder, how many cards are just broken for what they are, banned in other formats. And I don't think that's a good way to determine power level. I don't know that that's a good indicator even of the deck being good. You can build a $10,000 deck that does next to nothing. You can also build a $100 deck that runs away with every game and pub stomps every LGS they walk into. And that brings us to the third category. These are cards that aren't powerful on their own, but have really strong synergy. My favorite example of this is Kadena, Slinking Sorceress. In a vacuum, it's a 4-mana 3/3 that doesn't do anything else. But if you build a deck around it, you're dropping morph spells for free, drawing extra cards. It becomes a very powerful card, even though it and everything else in the deck is not. Morph cards aren't super good, but if you never have to pay the 3 mana to put them face down, they become pretty strong. And so building a deck around that, well, you can get up to CEDH levels. It's a little weird, and I think once people catch on to the gimmick, it's a little easy to stop, because without the commander, the deck doesn't do a lot. But it does represent a power level that you need to be aware of, and I think there's a lot of decks that fall into that category. A good example would be the mono blue Urza, Lord High Artificer. You don't have to have power in the rest of the deck. The commander itself is good enough as long as you jam a bunch of artifacts into the deck, have some draw, some mana acceleration, you can still run away with the game. And it won't even be close. If your opponents don't have a way to respond to it, you just win outright. And that's because the commander, on its own, is mechanically very strong, is structurally very strong, and has really strong synergy with a single card type that you can just fill the rest of your deck. Decks like that are the ones that are a little bit more difficult to evaluate, and one of the reasons why a lot of people, when they say, oh, the deck isn't that powerful even though I'm running this specific card, it doesn't always matter. Sometimes cards will break through whatever ceiling you would generally put on a single strong card in the deck. To illustrate this a little bit and talk more about how these different power levels interact, I want to think of a few specific cards in a vacuum. So we talked about Rhystic Study. It allows you to draw a bunch of extra cards, and if your opponents, if the rest of the table lets you get away with it, you're so far ahead in the game, it's hard for you to lose. Another card that helps you get ahead is Mana Crypt. A lot of people use this as a good card to hold up as an example of a high-powered deck. If you are running Mana Crypt, your deck must be bonkers. Not necessarily true. I think Mana Crypt is only slightly more powerful than Sol Ring, but nobody bats an eye at every single deck running Sol Ring. And that's just because of the cost difference, right? I think we need to step away from using cost as the determining factor. So if we are talking Mana Crypt, how far ahead does that get you? It's kind of like playing 2 additional lands. But they only produce colorless, and they might deal damage to you, so it's kind of a couple steps forward, 1 step back. It's, 2 turns worth of additional mana, but the real benefit comes when you play it early. The impact of each individual step in early turns is so much greater than later turns. So even playing a Sol Ring and a Mana Crypt on turn 1, even though it's only 1 turn ahead, it's a third of what you're going to get out of your Rhystic Study, probably. Turn 2, it gives you so much mana, you can use that to continually creep ahead. It's kind of the difference between, as a parent with small children, the difference between a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old is dramatic. The difference between a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old, a lot less so. And you can convert that into kind of turns of magic. If you can go from turn 1 to turn 2 immediately, you're probably going to win the game. It becomes archenemy, and even then they might not be able to catch up. Going from turn 6 to turn 7, though, probably doesn't matter so much. If you assume that every game of Magic in a commander format with a multiplayer at the table ends in about 10 times all the way around the table, I think it's a good metric. If someone's trying to slow it down, it can be slower than that. If someone's trying to speed it up, they can go faster than that. And use those quarters as a good measure. You can tell when people are getting close to winning. If they've had an uninterrupted Rhystic Study going for a few turns, well, they might only be on turn 5 or 6, but they have 3 extra turns worth of draws. So they're probably getting up there, even if their board doesn't look that intimidating. And that's something to be aware of for that threat assessment in-game. But also before the game, the consistency with which they can get to those big, powerful, structural pieces is going to determine how powerful their deck is. Now, let's walk through a deck that I have, that I consider very powerful. And I want to talk about which pieces do what, and why I consider this deck so powerful. Alright, so this was my first extremely powerful EDH deck that I put together. This is the Gitrog monster. I built it many years ago for a CEDH tournament. It was one of the first local ones that we had. I believe the prize was a From the Vault lore, and it was kind of my first foray into trying to build competitively. Up until that point, I'd played Commander pretty casually, but I had a number of Golgari decks that were very strong. So combining some of those pieces with a new Commander, I put together the CEDH deck. The core of the deck is your Commander here, the Gitrog monster, and using the metrics that I mentioned earlier, as a structural power, it has the ability to draw a card every time a land hits the graveyard. So you can build your deck with a lot of things that send lands to the graveyard, and it also sends a land to the graveyard on its own. So it does allow you to draw a bunch of extra cards, play extra lands, and kind of get ahead of the rest of the table once it's in play. But typically, you are only using it for its last line of its ability. Whenever a land hits the graveyard, you draw a card. Mechanically, the card is also strong. 5 mana for a 6/6 Death Touch is a strong stat line. It's a frog horror, and it just doesn't get much better than that. And then finally, synergistically, there's a lot of cares about lands cards, and it's easy to load the deck up with several to make that combo happen. The primary combo is the Gitrog monster paired with Wild Mongrel and Dakmor Salvage. Wild Mongrel can be replaced with any creature with a discard outlet. There are several. There is Noose Constrictor, there is Putrid Imp, there is Oblivion Crown, and it doesn't really matter as long as you have a way to reliably discard cards, as many as you want, over the course of a turn. You essentially win the game, because by discarding Dakmor Salvage, you draw a card. And Dakmor Salvage has Dredge, so you replace that draw by milling 2 and putting Dakmor Salvage into your hand. If either of those 2 cards that you milled off the top of your deck was a land, you draw another card. And then in response to that draw, you can discard Dakmor Salvage again, use the new draw as a Dredge, and so you can build up a stack of as many draw triggers as you want, and essentially draw your entire deck. You might be wondering what happens if you mill yourself out. And that's kind of where a card we saw earlier comes into play. Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. I have a couple other cards in the deck that also do this, but when he hits the graveyard, you shuffle your graveyard back into your library. So you don't mill out. You never mill out. You can do this an infinite number of times and build up enough draw triggers to draw as many cards as you want. Because of that, any spell you cast, you can immediately discard Kozilek to shuffle back into your deck and draw those as well. So things like Dark Ritual and other things that provide mana allow you to have infinite mana. So you have infinite draws, you have infinite mana, you have infinite power toughness on Wild Mongrel. It can be any color you want at any given time. There are so many different ways to win with the deck. I think the win condition I have right now is a sorcery, but there's also instant speed options, and it's just a very reliable, consistent, powerful deck. But the structure of the deck is a little odd, because it doesn't have a whole lot of powerful cards. So let's set these aside for a moment and walk through kind of the way that I have the deck built. The first thing that I'm going to point to is the mana base, because I think this might be a little bit different than you were generally expecting for a CEDH deck. I am running 40 lands. And I'm not running as many fetch lands as you would generally run in this deck. I have a few that allow me to search for things, and then I have a whole bunch of lands that just tap for any color. I have found with the prevalence of specifically Ob Nixilis, but other cards that punish dealing damage to yourself, running too many fetch lands can be a liability. So I've pulled a lot of those out. It might just be my local metagame, but it is something to consider for powerful decks. I'm running a significant number of basics over a lot of the more streamlined lists. I could probably replace most of these with non-basics that do other useful things for me, but I like being able to hit colors. Dryad Arbor is just a must-have. We have a few things that allow you to produce multiple mana. I'm still running a couple of the cycling lands, just because of how well they loop with both the Gitrog monster and Life from the Loam, which we will go over later. So I am running those. A Glacial Chasm is a good way to shut off aggro-based boards, and there's not a whole lot of land destruction running around, except for the occasional strip mine. So I'm running that. I have a Bajuka Bog for the odd graveyard deck, and a handful of other useful lands with sack outlets to trigger the Gitrog monster and just be able to cycle through my deck using just the lands that I already have in play. A consideration that I haven't completely landed on yet is running Emergence Zone. It ticks a couple of those boxes, being able to sacrifice itself as well as allow me to play spells at instant speed, which works because my win condition, as I said right now, is a sorcery. So this would allow me to do that during my opponent's upkeep, is usually a really good time if you have the ability. But currently, that's not included in the list. The benefit of running 40 lands is I can be very selective with my mulligans because I consistently hit my lands regardless. So let's move on to the first avenue of power. Obviously, having the right colors provides consistency. Being able to hit your land drops every turn is really nice, but on a CEDH table, that's just not enough. So running a selection of artifacts that increase your mana and allow you to get ahead of the rest of the table to get those pseudo extra turns online as early as possible is really necessary. There's a few that I'm missing here. Some of those are price constrained. Some of those are just preferential. So there is no Mox Diamond, as much as I wish I had one, and a couple of other cards I have excluded. So I'm running 6 artifacts to accelerate mana. We have a handful of instants that accelerate mana, and like I said, once the combo's online, any of these 3 will represent infinite mana to allow you to do whatever you want afterwards. Then we have our Mana Dork package. Most of these are elves. We have a bird doing a good impression of an elf, and we also have our temporary elf mana acceleration. But all of these help us get online quickly, and so typically we are hitting Gitrog monster and the full combo by about turn 3. And usually we have a way to protect it. But between this assortment of cards, we can accelerate our mana very quickly with a Carpet of Flowers, Wild Growth, Burgeoning, and Squandered Resources. We have other avenues of generating extra mana to get there as fast as we can. So if we are talking about structural power, all of these cards are helping us get ahead. All of them, especially put into this quantity. In total, we have over 20 cards that allow us to ramp ahead of our opponents and essentially get extra turns in before we go for our big combo. Speaking of extra turns, there is also an assortment of cards that provide additional benefits, 3 of them being draw power, one of them being a backup for the Gitrog monster, or in addition to the Gitrog monster, being able to play lands out of the graveyard to trigger the Gitrog monster extra times. And finally, a Scourge Familiar, which is an alternative and kind of an upgrade from Wild Mongrel if we have the 5 mana to pay for it. Typically, there is some assortment of getting the Gitrog monster into play with the discard outlet, cycling through our deck until we can find Scourge Familiar, and then looking for a way to muster up the 5 mana to continue going to reach that infinite mana using Scourge Familiar, so we don't have to deal with rituals. We can just discard cards. And that represents the total of our structural powered cards. Moving on, I think the next piece that we should cover is our mechanically powerful cards. There could be some argument for some of these cards not being as powerful as they once were, but a lot of them work very well, at least in the metagame that I'm in. If we already have a lot of extra mana, we have ways of filtering these things together to take care of some of the major threats. The one consideration I'm making is removing Innocent Blood. It's still in here to take care of a couple corner cases where I can get into the combo but can't win because people have creatures in play. And usually Innocent Blood plus a couple other creatures that I can cast and then sacrifice allow me to clear the board, sans my commander and discard outlet. And so a combination of these cards all having their specific cases and impact on the board. If I was to identify flex slots, I think most of them would be in this set of cards. Obviously, we need our 2 reshufflers, but everything else should be tailored to whatever metagame you happen to be in. But I would say that these are the mechanically powerful cards and the cards that generally help me win the game and protect my combo. So it's definitely a consideration which of these you keep in, which you trade out. But for me, this is the set that works best. Just for completion's sake, I would like to walk through some of the other pieces that we have in the deck. These are our backups for the combo. Discard outlets that can back up for Wild Mongrel and allow you to continue discarding cards. Another good backup that I think you have to have is other cards with Dredge. I'm only running 3. Some decks run more, some decks run less. These are soft backups for Dakmor Salvage. If you have a card with Dredge and the Gitrog monster, anytime you could draw a card, instead you can discard a card with Dredge, dredge that back, and if a land is milled within those dredged cards, you can discard this in response to do it over and over again. So a soft combo allows you to cycle through your deck with one of these dredge cards to find more dredge cards, eventually find the Dakmor Salvage, and then go for the win. Finally, my win condition, I have an Exsanguinate as an outlet for all that infinite mana, and a Witherbloom Command. Witherbloom Command is nice because you can play it early up front in order to just have a little bit more utility, get some things into the graveyard, and play around some of the things that your opponent is trying to get online early. And late game, you can loop it over and over with your infinite mana to make target opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. And that can also win you the game, if for some reason your Exsanguinate is unavailable. Now you may notice there is a notable exception that I haven't gone through, and this is the backbone of any CEDH deck, and that's all the tutors. So all of these, in my mind, act as backups for the other cards in the deck. We have some that search for non-basic lands. This allows you to find your Dakmor Salvage early. We have some that search for creatures to find our discard outlets and other utility things in the deck. We have the ones that search for anything. Some of these go to the top of the library, some go to the graveyard, and some go straight to your hand. But all of these cards allow you to find the pieces that you need for the combo when you need them. I would tend to bucket all of these in that mechanically powerful bucket, but because they kind of just represent redundancy, I don't know necessarily that having tutors increases the power level of a deck unless the other cards in the deck also meet that power level. Finally, I have one card in the consideration bucket that's Culling Ritual. I think it's a really nice removal set. It can be really powerful at certain tables, and I'm definitely considering that for this deck, flexing that in. I think that just about makes up the sum total of what this deck tries to do and the cards that they use to do it. If you have any questions about how it's built, drop me a line. Any suggestions are also welcome. So I know power level is one of those things that people have a lot of arguments over. And a lot of the problems at the table stem from mismatches in power level or mismatches in expectation of power level. And I don't think there's a good solution to it. I think that often people are poor judges of their own deck's power, and even worse judges of their opponent's power level. Over the course of a game, you might see somebody experience the best game of their life. They drew hot, they got everything on curve, they got all of their lands exactly when they needed them, and all of them were in the right colors, and they just ran away with the game. And that doesn't necessarily speak towards the deck's power level or your evaluation of the power level. And I think a lot of the problems can be handled with threat assessment and people at the table working together to shut down the people that are actually ahead and not just the people that have the biggest board. But if we can be a little more upfront with what our deck does and how well the different pieces work together, I think we can have better experiences at the table. So I encourage you to take a second look at your deck. Determine how much of it is committed to those small advantages that add up into extra turns. and maybe reevaluate the power level of your deck in practice. In theory, you might have many powerful cards that don't do a whole lot together, or you might have a whole bunch of weak cards that run away with the game. And just because your deck is $20, that doesn't make it a 6. And just because your opponent's deck is $20,000 doesn't mean that they are pub stomping or that they have a CEDH deck. So if you have a metric for measuring deck performance or finding out how to categorize your decks or your opponent's deck outside of the 1 or 2 point range that's frequently used, I'd like to hear about it. I'd like to know how you evaluate your own deck, because I tend to have a blindfold on. I say, this is kind of what I'm trying to do. These are some of the cards that I have in there, but I've been playing a long time. I don't know how expensive stuff is, and I really don't know how things will play on the table with some of the newer EDH stuff that's come out. There's definitely times where I've played against somebody and been very confused with their deck being 4 or 5 turns ahead and nobody really paying attention because they're playing a slightly upgraded precon. And so nobody really is all that concerned, despite the fact that they are running away with the game. And there's been times when I've played a precon, not realizing how nutty it can get. It happens. And those under-evaluations of power level or over-evaluations of power levels can really mess things up. But I think that's something we work on. We practice, you play a bunch, and sometimes you have a bad game, and it goes super sour. It's not fun to play. The decks don't work great against each other. You have a huge mismatch in power level or just strategy. I remember I played one game where I was playing as Yurlok, and I had a really strong mana burn setup. And one of my opponents, they were on kind of 5-color good stuff, but they got Kenrith into play, and I didn't have anything I could do. They could just spend the mana down on whatever, and they ran away with the game. And there was literally nothing I could do. And that's just a mismatch in strategy. And I don't think it was intentional. I think it just kind of happened. But that's definitely one of those instances where, one of us probably should have played a different deck, and it would have been a much better play experience. But if you do have something that goes south like that, like what we did, you shuffle up different decks and try again. EDH games aren't meant to go 3 to 4 hours. Some of them do. Sometimes it's a bit of a slog, but I don't think that's inherent to the game. And I think even at low power levels, you can have games that are over in 20 to 30 minutes. So shuffle up, try again, and hey, maybe next time you get a better game out of it. It's been nice talking to you.